What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and we're back for another episode of Poker Hands. And today we're going to be taking a look at an EPT hand that was suggested by one of the viewers. And frankly, I still can't believe the way this hand went down. On that note, let's jump into the action.
Well, for once, if this hand actually gets going, Parlafes in a rare spot of actually dominating Dimov's hand.
Our hand begins with the play being heads up for the 2015 EPT DeVille title, and Parlafes decided to come in for a limp on the button with Queen 8 off. And I'm not saying you can't limp it heads up. Certainly you could try and do it with some different hands, but in general I would advocate, especially here when you're almost 40 blinds deep or 35 blinds deep, in general I would advocate to either be raising or folding. If you start limping, it gets kind of weird and you have to balance it out. You have to put some good hands in the limp and some good hands in the raise. And I think it's much more simple to just either fold or raise your hand. That's a pretty good way to play heads up poker. Now over to the big blind, Dimov has 10-8 suited and definitely an opportunity to raise it up. And he decides to go ahead and check. You know, I think I'd like to see a raise here. This hand definitely can over-realize post-flop. You have some fold equity pre-flop, and the kinds of hands you flop are more likely to be draws. So you gain a lot by raising this hand. I will say that if you think your opponent is likely to limp re-raise you, this hand is very ugly to face that, because if you get limp re-raised, you probably have to call, but it's kind of dicey because you're not totally sure where you're at. So maybe he was scared of that happening. However, I think what's much more likely is he's just playing a little too conservative against the limp here in the big blind. Anyway, so we have a limp and a check, and that's about as much talking as I can do with no real action. Let's take a flop.
It depends if anyone's interested post-flop. Up and down, though. Now for Dimov.
Unlikely to fold to this bet from Parlafes.
Agreed.
Nerp.
The flop comes 9-7 deuce with two spades, and Dimov flops an open-ended straight draw to the nuts on both sides. Parlafes, meanwhile, only has a backdoor straight draw and an overcard, and the action checks to him. Here he can either check and decide to play some turns, or he can go ahead and bet the flop, and frankly, I'm cool with either decision. If you do bet the flop, you can barrel on turns where you have straight draws, maybe you can barrel on turns with some overcards, and if you hit a queen or an 8, you're likely to have the best hand. However, if you check back, you can decide to play some turns, and then if the turn is a card like a 6, you can call a probe and have a straight draw that's kind of concealed. So I don't really mind either play here. I guess I would maybe lean a little bit more towards betting. He does decide to bet 200,000 into a pot of 280,000. I like this size on a board with a lot of draws like this. When you do bet, you generally want to pick a size that charges more of those hands. Over to the big blind, and now Dimov has a choice to make. He can either go for the check raise or go for the check call. Now, I think mixing in some check raises would be good, but there is a problem with check raising. If you check raise 10-8 and get 3-bet, you're in a very dicey spot. You're not sure whether you should call or raise, and you might not be getting the odds to draw out of position. If you do call and you improve to a 10 or an 8 or the straight, then you're going to be able to continue on any of those turns and maybe work in some check raises on later streets. So I think I'd prefer to see a call, but I don't mind seeing a raise, and he goes ahead and flats here on the flop. So I'm on board with both players' actions here. Let's take a turn.
Are you ready for the 6?
Unbelievable.
Ouch. I do apologise if I was involved in any way in making that happen retrospectively in time.
I just think it was, it's just been clear the way this guy's been running during this heads-up battle.
The turn is a 6, which is a terrible card for Parlafes. At this point, if he does improve to a straight, he's still going to be beat, or maybe chop on a 10, and now he's picked up additional equity that he should be using to barrel. When Dimov checks to him, now he has a great opportunity to fire about 400,000 to 500,000. However, he's up against the stone nuts. Well, maybe he's on the next level here because he decides to check it back, but then I have to ask the question, why bet this hand the flop if you're going to be giving up the turn when you turn equity? This is a good chance to continue telling your story. Say you have an overpair, say you have top pair, say you turned a straight, and do so with a hand that has equity against your opponent's range. So I don't like the action here. However, let's take a river.
What do you reckon, the queen on the end just to cement his death? No, is okay.
Oh. So Parlafes Hits a straight himself
Oh,
on the
this
river,
is-
but it's
this
the dummy end of the straight.
Yeah, this is the worst thing ever.
Yeah, there was me just thinking about the queen, but yeah, this is potentially even worse. Oh Lord. Ugh. I mean, this is just an absolute brain melter, isn't it? Oh man, a full rack of mackerel.
He's bombing it. 680,000 in the middle. And he bets 1.2 million.
And must be praying for exactly what's going on here.
Parlafes is laughing as if almost like he knows.
The river comes in offsuit 5, and this is about as bad as things can get for Parlafes here. Now his opponent has the nut straight, there's no flush out there, there's no ability to have a full house, and he has the 1 card straight, putting him in a terrible situation. In these spots, you're almost always going to lose a lot of money, and sometimes all of it. Now at this point, Dimov decides to bet about 1.2 million into a pot of 700,000. And while I think that this decision is okay, he's sort of hoping that his opponent has a straight as well, and I think that that's really unlikely. If your opponent did turn a straight draw, in general he should be betting those hands on the turn, so it's unlikely he has a hand like Queen 8, because if that hand bets the flop, it should be barreling the turn. It's possible, however, his opponent has a hand like 6-8, where he bet a straight draw on the flop, turned a pair to show down, checked it back, and then never hit a straight, and maybe he could have a few other hands like Ace-8 or King-8, but even those I think are somewhat unlikely. So if I'm on the river here in the big blind, while I don't mind using a large size because I think it's so unlikely my opponent has a straight, I'd like to see maybe a little bit of a smaller size here than this. If you do overbet, I don't really know if you even want to be using the nut straight, because when you have the nut straight and you bet small, if your opponent has a straight, they're probably going to raise you. So in this situation, I'd like to see a bet of more along the lines of 400,000 or 500,000, and that way he can also decide to bet when he has a hand like 2 pair. In fact, if you have a hand like a good 9 here, I don't really see a problem in betting it. How often is a hand like Ace-9 really behind? Your opponent doesn't have 9-6, doesn't have 9-7, doesn't have a set, doesn't have a straight. What really beats you here on the river? Really only a straight, and there are not many that would be checking back on the turn. So I don't mind using a smaller size to allow yourself room to go for thin value, and that way you can work in some bluffs with some hands like Jack 10 or maybe 2 spades. So I'm not a huge fan of the overbet. I don't think it really ends up making very much sense. I don't think your opponent has an 8 very much. However, you might counter that because your opponent doesn't have an 8. It makes a lot of sense to be overbetting. So some different ways of thinking here on the river, but what will Parlafes do now that he has this tough spot?
Snakes alive. What on earth is going through Dany Parlafes' head here? He must be just screaming at himself.
Benny says he's never ever going to raise this overbet. Never gets called by anything worse. He's legit thinking about folding.
$1.2 million to call.
Trying to make me fold off the split.
Ah!
I have to take my shirt off and run around the building.
Wow, you do. You did promise. That's incredible.
Great laydown by Dany Parlafes.
All right, so there's a lot of people accusing me lately that I always side with what people should have done because it's the correct thing, and if there was an award, I'd be Monday morning quarterback of the year. Well, I'm going to say this. Here, even though Parlafes makes an amazing fold, a fold that I personally could never make, is absolutely the wrong play. An 8 is one of the strongest hands that he can even have here, and additionally, there's some chance that Dimov simply has an 8 himself and is value betting. If he just has a hand like Ace-8 and river to straight, why not overbet the pot? You're frankly never going to be beat, and it's unlikely your opponent's even chopping. It makes a lot of sense to go big. So in this spot, you just have to call. If this was more like 2, 3, 4 million, maybe we could think about it. The answer is you probably still can't think about it, but you have to call this, man. I mean, you're not going to have better hands than this. If your opponent knew you'd make a fold this big, they can start relentlessly bluffing you. What if he has a hand like Jack 10 or spades or any of those holdings? I mean, sick read, and I guess at the end of the day, you were right, so who am I to say anything? But When you have good hands and your opponent has you beat, sometimes it's just your time to die. I want to thank Raskolnikov32 for the suggestion. And if you guys ever have something you want to suggest for an episode of Poker Hands, I do go through those comments. You can tweet at Doug Polk Poker, and I'd be more than happy to take a look.